In 2020, Egypt formally communicated to American mediators that military action was a possible response if the GERD dispute failed diplomatically. U.S. mediation collapsed. African Union mediation produced no binding agreement. Ethiopia completed the dam. The reservoir fills. Egypt watches its water security erode in real time. In a country where 97% of fresh water comes from one river it no longer fully controls. The GERD dispute is the most consequential water conflict in the world. It has no diplomatic solution currently in sight. This episode examines what that means. The Nile is the world's longest river, approximately 650 kilometers from its most remote source in Burundi to its delta in the Mediterranean. It has two principal tributaries, the White Nile, originating in Lake Victoria and providing approximately 15% of Egypt's water, and the Blue Nile, originating at Lake Tana in the Ethiopian Highlands and providing approximately 85%. The GERD is built on the Blue Nile, the tributary that carries the majority of Egypt's water supply. Ethiopia controls the source of 85% of Egypt's fresh water. The GERD gives Ethiopia, for the first time in history, the ability to regulate that flow. That is the specific reason Egypt calls it existential. The geography created the dispute before the dam was built. The 1959 Nile Waters Agreement. The treaty governing Nile water allocation was signed between Egypt and Sudan. Ethiopia was not a party. It was not invited. The agreement allocated 55.5 billion cubic meters per year to Egypt and 18.5 billion to Sudan, totaling 74 billion cubic meters, approximately the entire Nile's average annual flow. 0 was allocated to Ethiopia, or to Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, Burundi, or Eritrea. The other Nile Basin countries. The treaty's foundational premise. The countries that use the Nile historically have permanent rights to its water. Ethiopia's position: we were not party to that treaty, we do not recognize it, and we will develop our own water resources. The earlier colonial water treaty, the 1929 Anglo-Egyptian Agreement, gave Egypt the right to veto any upstream projects that reduced the Nile's flow to Egypt. It was signed between Britain and Egypt. Ethiopia was a sovereign state in 1929, one of only 2 African countries never colonized, and was not party to an agreement that gave Egypt veto power over Ethiopian water infrastructure. Ethiopia has consistently rejected the 1929 agreement's applicability. Egypt has consistently insisted on its validity. The specific legal dispute is irresolvable without a new framework. One side has rights under treaties that the other was never party to. No international legal mechanism can impose a resolution on a sovereign state regarding a river that originates in its own territory. Ethiopia's case for the GERD is documented, straightforward, and morally compelling within its own framework. Ethiopia has approximately 120 million people, Africa's second most populous country. Approximately 45% of Ethiopians had no access to electricity when the GERD project began. Ethiopia has the second largest untapped hydroelectric potential in Africa after the DRC. The Blue Nile Gorge, the specific geographic feature the GERD exploits, drops approximately 1,500 meters in elevation across the Ethiopian Highlands, creating one of the most productive hydroelectric sites on Earth. The dam will generate approximately 150 megawatts of electricity, enough to power approximately 60% of Ethiopia's current electricity needs and to export significant quantities to neighboring countries. The GERD was funded entirely by Ethiopia, without World Bank, IMF, or major bilateral donor financing. Through a combination of government bonds sold to Ethiopians, payroll deductions from Ethiopian civil servants, and private financing. The funding structure was a deliberate political statement. Ethiopia would build its most consequential infrastructure project without the conditionality or approval of international institutions that might have imposed requirements to accommodate Egypt's concerns. Ethiopian citizens bought bonds to fund the dam. Ethiopian civil servants contributed a month's salary. The GERD is not a foreign-funded project imposed on Ethiopia by outside interests. It is the specific product of Ethiopian national will, Ethiopian national financing, and Ethiopian national political decision. That ownership makes its political resolution more complex, not less. Egypt's argument against the GERD's filling speed, its primary diplomatic position, is based on the specific hydrological mathematics of a country with almost no alternative fresh water sources. Egypt receives approximately 560 cubic meters of fresh water per person per year, below the international water poverty threshold of 1.0 cubic meters and far below the global average of approximately 7.0. Approximately 97% of that water comes from the Nile. Egyptian agriculture, which employs approximately 28% of the workforce, depends almost entirely on Nile irrigation. The specific Egyptian concern, a rapid filling of the GERD reservoir during drought years, could reduce the Nile's flow to Egypt by 25 to 40%, triggering agricultural collapse, food insecurity, and political instability simultaneously. The diplomatic failure of the GERD negotiations is documented across multiple failed frameworks. The Nile Basin Initiative, the multilateral body created in 1999 to develop a shared legal framework for the Nile's 10 basin countries, collapsed when Egypt and Sudan refused to ratify the cooperative framework agreement that the other 8 countries, including Ethiopia, negotiated and signed. The African Union mediation process, which began in 2020, has produced multiple rounds of talks and no binding agreement. The U.S. mediation of 2019-2020, in which the Trump administration attempted to broker a deal, produced a draft agreement that Ethiopia refused to sign, accusing the U.S. of taking Egypt's side. Every mediation framework has failed because the fundamental positions are incompatible within any framework that both sides could accept. Sudan's position, the most underreported dimension of the GERD dispute, has evolved significantly since the dam's construction began. Initially aligned with Egypt in opposition to the dam, Sudan has increasingly recognized the specific benefits the GERD provides. Flood regulation of the Blue Nile's notoriously dangerous seasonal flooding, regularized year-round flow that benefits Sudanese agriculture, and significant quantities of relatively cheap electricity from the GERD's generation. Sudan's reservoirs and center dams, downstream from the GERD, have historically suffered from sedimentation and irregular flow. The GERD's regulation addresses both problems. Sudan's shift has isolated Egypt diplomatically and made a unified downstream position against Ethiopia impossible to maintain. The Blue Nile Gorge, the geographic feature that the GERD harnesses, is one of Africa's most extraordinary and least visited natural landscapes. The gorge cuts approximately 1,500 meters deep into the Ethiopian Highlands, over approximately 400 kilometers, creating a canyon system that rivals the Grand Canyon in scale. The Blue Nile Falls, 'tis a bay in Amharic, meaning smoking water, near Lake Tanadrop, approximately 45 meters in a curtain of water that is among the most spectacular waterfalls in Africa. The gorge's specific biodiversity includes gelada baboons, found nowhere else on Earth, and numerous endemic bird species. The Blue Nile Gorge has been inaccessible to most visitors because of its remoteness and terrain, preserving a natural world that is entirely unknown outside specialist circles. The Ethiopian Highlands that feed the Blue Nile are one of the world's most extraordinary highland ecosystems, a biological island of high-altitude grassland and forest that hosts species found nowhere else on Earth. The Simien Mountains National Park, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, contains the simian fox, the world's rarest canid, the gelada baboon, a grass-eating primate found only in Ethiopia, and the walia ibex. The park's landscape, dramatic basalt escarpments dropping thousands of meters to the lowlands below, the specific extraordinary visual of the African Rift's geological drama. The Ethiopian highlands are also the origin of coffee. Wild coffee plants still grow in the Ethiopian forests, making Ethiopia the specific geographic source of the world's most consumed hot beverage. The water dispute runs through one of the world's great ecological landscapes. The GERD disputes 3 primary scenario trajectories in 2026, and the honest assessment of their relative probability. The first, continued diplomatic deadlock with operational coexistence. The dam operates. Egypt manages with reduced but not catastrophically reduced flows in most years. No agreement is reached, but no military action occurs. The drought year risk remains unresolved. If a multi-year Nile drought coincides with GERD reservoir filling, the crisis scenario becomes acute. This is the current situation in 2026 and the most probable single-year outcome in any given year. The second, a negotiated agreement on filling speed and drought year protocols, requires both governments to accept something they have publicly said they will not accept. Possible, but requires political conditions neither government currently has. The third scenario, military conflict, is the least probable but the most consequential. The specific military problem: any Egyptian military action against the GERD would require crossing Sudanese airspace, which Sudan may not grant. It would involve striking a dam that holds 74 billion cubic meters of water, A dam strike could produce a catastrophic flood downstream that would kill thousands of Sudanese civilians. It would produce an Ethiopian military and political response that could destabilize the Horn of Africa. It would likely produce international condemnation, including from Egypt's Arab allies. And it would not solve the underlying problem. Even a destroyed dam could be rebuilt, and Ethiopia's political commitment to the project would only be strengthened by an attack. The military option is documented as a real consideration. Its strategic logic does not withstand analysis. The GERD dispute's fundamental lesson, the one that extends beyond the specific Egypt-Ethiopia-Sudan triangle, is that the world is entering a water security era in which rivers shared between countries will produce conflicts that the existing international legal framework is inadequate to manage. The GERD is the most advanced current case of an upstream country using its geographic position to develop water resources that downstream countries have historically claimed. But it is not the only case. The Mekong River dispute, China damming the Mekong upstream from Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The Indus Waters Treaty under stress between India and Pakistan. The Colorado River's over-allocation between the United States and Mexico. The Jordan River's long-disputed allocation. Water wars, which experts have predicted for decades, are not arriving as sudden conflicts. They are arriving as the GERD arrived, slowly, technologically, and legally ambiguously. Africa's largest dam, Egypt's most ancient civilization, the world's longest river, the most consequential water dispute in the world. With no diplomatic solution in sight, a military threat that cannot be executed without catastrophic consequences, and a drought year scenario that remains unresolved while both countries' populations continue to grow and water demand continues to increase. The GERD will generate electricity for Ethiopia. The Nile will continue to flow to Egypt, reduced in drought years, regularized in others. The dispute will continue until a new international water law framework makes resolution possible, or until a drought year makes resolution urgent, in the worst possible circumstances. History in Progress continues. The next episode in the Economic Turning Points series covers the story of how a single metal box invented in 1956 globalized the world economy. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the story doesn't end here, it evolves. The river flows. The dam stands. The dispute continues. And the next drought year is coming.